so many of you who've got 84, which is absolutely incredible. Feel free to use the chat window as we go through the session to sort of ask any questions, and I'll try and pick them out as I go through. If not, we will save some time at the end, sort of 10, 15 minutes or so, just for any Q&A, just to sort of wrap things up at the end. So do feel free to ask any questions as we go through. As Jim sort of mentioned, this is the first in a series of 3 webinars for, well, first in 3 webinars this week, but we've got 25 CPD webinars for AQA teachers, starting with this one, which is really setting the scene with planning in year 2 and smart option choices. 2 more this week. So if you're teaching schizophrenia, there is one tomorrow night at 8:30 again, what you really need to know if you're teaching this topic, plus some sort of good teaching hints and tips for that. And then probably our most popular one, with over 160 teachers now signed up, looking at Year 2 biopsychology on Thursday at 4:15. All of the resources, slides will all be made available afterwards, so you don't need to write any notes down. You can sit back, relax, and ask questions, and keep your eye on the chat window. Okay, so this particular session is broken into kind of three main parts. I've called the first part Less is More and Don't Overteach. And within that, I'm going to sort of look at how to avoid overteaching in terms of AO1 and AO3 content, and how to develop those sort of important AO2 skills. In the second part, I'm going to look at how to make the most out of the Year 2 topics that you're going to be choosing this year. And I've broken that into kind of 4 subsections, so selecting the best topics, or arguably the shortest topics might be sensible. How to use Year 2 topics to revise Year 1 content. Looking at overlap between the different topics, and then what I think is one of the most important things, mapping the issues and debates to the different Year 1 and Year 2 content. I think that can make or break the new linear A-level. We'll finish the evening just looking at sort of the order of teaching, what to teach and when to teach it, and I'll provide you with sort of a year plan scheme of work, type of document that you can use that may help you if you haven't already got one. So let's make a start. So this first section, less is more, not over teaching. I'm going to launch a few polls just to start with, because I'm curious of sort of who's new to teaching. So I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and you should be able to answer on your screens now. So for the first one, I just want to find out who's new to teaching AQA this year. So Jim, if you wouldn't mind launching that poll for us, that'd be great. So I'll give you a few seconds just to answer yes or no to that first question. Okay, brilliant. So about 20% of you in here new to AQA, so hopefully you'll get lots from this evening, and hopefully the same for the other 80% of you. Just one more question that I'm really curious of. I want to know who out of you are going fully linear this year. So for your new group of sort of AS students or Year 1 students, will you not be entering them for the exam? So you're going fully linear this year, yes or no? Very interesting. About 50-50 on that one. Okay, that's interesting. Slightly different to what I would have assumed, but okay, very, very good stuff. Okay, so onto this first section, less is more, not over teaching. The first thing I just want to point out, which I think is important, is that the weighting at A level, so Year 2, the full linear course, of the assessment objectives changes ever so slightly, okay? And the most significant change, and the one that you're going to want to be aware of, is the change to AO3 is the one that jumps up the most. So last year for the AS, the Year 1 students, around 30 to 32% was AO3 content. This year it goes up to 36 to 38%. So there's an increased importance on AO3 skills, which is just worth pointing out. In terms of AO1, and I think this again is very important, the maximum number of AO1 marks for any sort of single essay or topic is now 6 marks instead of 8, which it was in the sort of old legacy A-level. And that might not seem like a huge difference. If you're teaching your optional topics, for example, let's say you're teaching aggression this year, and you teach exactly the same content that you've taught every other year up until now, there is an argument to say that you're actually teaching too much. So my advice is, can you look back over your existing sort of lessons, your existing work, and actually just streamline it down a little bit, because they don't need as much AO1 knowledge this year. So yeah, the point there is just to keep this in the back of your mind if you're teaching any studies, any theories, that actually they need ever so slightly less this year than they would have needed previously. Now, in terms of AO3, and we're going to come back to this point a lot in this particular webinar, again, sticking with this idea of less is more, at AS, so the exams your students have just sat, the maximum number of AO3 marks on a single question was around 6. Where you'd expect sort of 3 decent evaluation points, 3 effective evaluation points could get them those 6 marks. At A-level, this has now gone up to 10, and we might sort of argue that you'd expect somewhere between 4 or 5 evaluation points. This is the sort of rumour that's going around AQA that we're aiming for about 4 to 5 this year. However, again, sticking with this point that less is more, I genuinely believe, and we're going to come back to this exact point later, that if you can train your students to embed further evaluation points into their essays and improve the quality of their evaluation through things like issues and debates, then fewer points will be required. Okay, and I've discussed this with many sort of examiners, and this is exactly correct. If you can get them to improve the quality, not the quantity of their evaluation, they can still achieve those 10 marks, and that's really, really important. That's Adam, that's exactly my next point, funny enough. With holistic marking, the key, of course, is quality rather than quantity, okay? And I'm going to point that out later on in this webinar, so yeah, absolutely the point I'm making. In terms of AO2, okay, this is probably the one little bit where less isn't essentially more here, actually. If anything, with AO2, probably more is more, and practice makes perfect. So the real key to sort of succeeding with AO2 is practice, practice, practice. What I've noticed, I've had a look through all of the new sample papers, of which there's 3 of them for year 2, and there is a lot more application, and the application is a lot more difficult. And I just want to show you 2 examples that I picked out that I think are particularly difficult, actually, just to kind of highlight the point I'm making here. So to show you these 2 questions. The first one, Josie's 12. Last year she was involved in a serious road accident and suffered from head injuries that caused problems with speech and understanding language. Now, 1 year later, she's recovered most of her language abilities. So nice little extract there. The question then says, using your knowledge of plasticity and functional recovery of a brain tumour, or brain after a tumour, trauma, explain Josie's recovery for 4 marks. So you can see in that biopsych question, quite a tricky application question that actually has 2 elements, both plasticity and functional recovery in there. That's then followed by discuss what research has shown about localization of function for 8 marks, of which again I've just highlighted the differences between AO1 and 3. There is more evaluation required even for that 8-marker question. Okay, so that's quite hard, I think, not an easy biopsych question. So just to show you that application is going to get much harder this year. On top of that, and this might come as a surprise to some of you, what AQA have done in sample paper 2 for every single optional unit is embedded inferential statistical testing into the options. So it's not just enough for students to know inferential statistics without being able to apply it to their other topics that you're going to teach them. Let's take a look at this one. I'm going to test you in a moment. So it says here, in a study of parasocial relationships, a researcher studied male and female attachments to their favourite film star. The overall attachment score was calculated on the basis of the answers to the questionnaire. A high score indicated a strong attachment, a low score indicated a little attachment. The question that goes with this, the researcher then decided to extend the study by using an inferential statistical test to see if the results were significant. Suggest an appropriate inferential test which the researcher could use. Let's see, just out of curiosity, I'm going to be really cruel here. Jim, can we launch the next poll? I'm curious if you can get which particular test it is correct. So I'll give you 15 seconds so just to answer that question, which test it is. Give it a go, even if you're not sure at this stage. Okay, I'll give you a few more seconds. Yes, the webinar will be available at the end. I think Jim's hit record today. Okay, 54% of you got it. Absolutely well done. The answer should have been Man Whitney, and we'll look why. But I just wanted to highlight actually how tricky these AO2 sort of application questions can be. You may have seen this already. This is our decision tree poster that we've designed specifically for this year. If you haven't ordered a copy yet, Jim's giving away, I think, 3,000 copies. So feel free to order multiple ones for your different classrooms. Absolutely correct. It should have been Man Whitney. The reason being is we couldn't have used a parametric test because the data that we're going to talk about in a minute wasn't interval or better. That leads us on to the next question. Was the data nominal? Of which, no, it wasn't. Was it a correlational experiment? Again, no, it wasn't. It was a test of the differences. Was it independent groups? Yes, we were looking at the difference between male and female, so therefore that would have left us with Man Whitney. For some of you, if you haven't got that particular one right, don't worry, we are hosting a whole, I think it's 9 webinars on understanding research methods, so feel free to join in any one of those. The posters are arriving from our printer this week, so if you haven't received it yet, it'll be on its way very, very soon. Okay, in terms of AO2, so sticking with AO2 just for a little while longer, what I hear most teachers say is that they struggle to come up with scenarios for AO2 and they find it very, very difficult to come up with new scenarios. And I'm just going to give you a few little hints and tips for this because actually there are lots of scenarios out there. The first thing is do refer back to all of the past papers for both AQA A and B. There are tons of great samples that you can use in AQA B that are particularly relevant for the new course, especially sort of biopsychology. Also, do check the sample papers for other examples. There's really great stuff in OCR and Edexcel which you can use. So I would suggest looking at other examples as well, okay? In terms of those of you that have got Exam Pro, you can actually filter and search by sample questions, and those with extracts, they're called scenario responses. So if you click on search, which you'll see on the screen, and scenario response, Exam Pro will filter out every single AO2 application question for you. I agree, Vanessa, Exam Pro is a lifesaver, and you'll see there that within this particular topic that I've looked at, there are 69, I think this is paper 1, 69 different sample papers with scenario response questions in it. So you can filter by that, print them off for the students. It's a really, really great resource. Okay, enough of AO2. Back to my sort of earlier point, we're going to look at AO3 in a moment. The other thing I've done, which hopefully you'll find useful, is I've gone through all of the new sample papers and I've mapped them out to the specification, kind of like the example you've seen on screen here. So for every point in the spec, I've just gone through and pulled out the sample questions and put them to that. Obviously, the exam papers are copyrighted, so I shouldn't really be giving a copy of this away, but we will make an Excel file available so you can download it, just so you can take a look and see where it's mapped out, because it's really, really useful to know for your different topics where the potential essay questions can come up, where the scenario questions come up, and so forth. So that will be made available shortly afterwards. Okay. Back to AO3 and the point I made earlier that less is more, and if you can train your students to embed further evaluations into their essays, then I think you can improve the quality of their evaluations, and fewer points will be required overall. There's two ways I think you can improve evaluation and embed further evaluation, okay? The first one is what I'm going to talk about today, which is adding an issue or debate. The second one is adding a counter-criticism. And what I want to spend sort of 5 minutes or so on is exploring a possible teaching strategy that can improve the sort of quality of evaluation without teaching your students anything new. And that's what I think is really going to be useful for saving time this year. Here's a really simple idea just to sort of get you started, get you going. Let's say you decided to revise a particular topic, and it might be phobias in this case, okay? I've pulled out one of the sample questions, which is a 16-mark essay question on phobias, discuss 2 behavioural treatments. Now, when it comes to evaluation, your students will need more points overall than they've learnt previously at AS. It's unlikely you would have taught them 5 or 6 points at AS, you probably taught them 3, okay? The question is, can we combine their existing knowledge from AS in year 1 with the new issues and debates to enhance their evaluation? And I think you can, and I'm going to sort of show you how you can do that now. So let's imagine a sort of a starter task. I used to do this all the time. You ask your students in a group to have a sort of mind map, possibly evaluation points they could use for this 16-mark question, okay? And you give them 5 minutes or so. And let's imagine after 5 minutes they come up with sort of 3 simple-ish points. They come up with research support, the McGrath study in 1990, which found that systematic desensitization was successful 75% of the time. They come up with a point that says it's relatively cost effective in comparison to CBT, and they come up with a third point that it doesn't work for all phobias. Now those 3 points are great points and can be turned into a nice simple evaluation. But what I want to explore now is, can we turn them into an even better evaluation point with very little work? The way to do that, and you may have seen this through our Facebook group, is this sort of a grenade poster that's been going around. Yes, I borrowed the idea from someone else, but I've adapted it to fit the new specification, so it wasn't my idea originally. I don't know whose it was. And across it now, what I've done is I've mapped out all of the new issues and debates, things like gender bias, reductionism versus holism, nature-nurture, idiographic, nomothetic, determinism, free will, etc. So you've got them all there. But I think what's going to help your students is underneath each one, I've posed questions that they can ask themselves, okay? I've highlighted one on screen that we're going to use now, and it's under determinism free will. I've said, is the behaviour a product of previous learning, classical operant conditioning? If so, then that's what would be called environmental determinism. So I think that could be used here. So if we go back to our sort of 3 evaluation points, the point that we made earlier, this idea that systematic desensitization doesn't work for all phobias, could be linked to this idea of environmental determinism, and getting your students to understand that link will improve the quality of their evaluation overall. So let's see what that might look like. If we imagine a very simple year 1 Berger style paragraph, okay, I used to teach my students the Berger technique. It really is just a point, evidence, explain paragraph, and I'm going to elaborate on this in a minute. They may have wrote something along the lines like this. So one issue with behaviourist treatments for phobias is that they don't work for all types of phobias. Absolutely fine starting point. They then bring in the example here because there's no evidence, they're just going to give an example. They might say, for example, patients with phobias that have not developed through personal experience, for example, a fear of heights, will not be effectively treated using behaviourist treatments, okay? You then just explain that, and I always tell my students to always start with this matters because it forces them to do that. So this matters because it suggests that behaviourist treatments are unable to effectively treat all types of phobias, in particular what we call evolutionary phobias, or ones that we're born with. Perfectly good evaluation point for a year one student, and really, really effective. What we want to do now, though, is using this sort of new issue and debate knowledge, is see if we can turn that sort of simple burger into what I kind of joked to my students and called a double whopper, but can't use that now, it's copyrighted. So a double burger. And the structure stays almost the same. We're just embedding an extra layer of information in there, an issue and a debate in there. And sort of hear me out, see what we think here. So we keep the point the same. We say one issue with these behaviourist treatments for phobias is that they don't work for all types of phobias. We keep our example exactly the same as well. We say, for example, patients with phobias which have not developed through personal experience, for example, fear of heights, are not effectively treated using these behaviourist treatments. And then this is where you can now start to improve the quality of the evaluation. That comes back to the point I think Adam made earlier about, is it quality over quantity? And it absolutely is. Because if you can then get your students to bring in that idea of environmental determinism here, you could add a nice point in like this. Furthermore, behaviourist explanations and treatments suggest that our behaviour is environmentally determined and caused by previous experience through things like classical and operant conditioning. However, some phobias, like those mentioned above, suggest that behaviour is not environmentally determined and there are other factors, possibly biological or inheritance, that might play a role. We've added in a really thorough point there, and then all we do again is we explain that, but now we're combining all of the information from above. So we would just say this matters because it suggests that the behaviourist treatments can't effectively treat all types of phobias, and that the treatments are based on environmental determinism, which doesn't take into account other factors, in particular these evolutionary sort of phobias, presenting a significant limitation for treating individuals. And you can see how actually the quality of that's improved, but it's still within 1 point. So they're writing a lot less, but really now they've ticked off 2 evaluation points for the price of 1, so to speak. So embedding will save them time, save them wording in their exam, which we know is really important. So that's what I would use for that. Okay, that's the end of session 1. I'm going to pause for sort of 30 seconds, a minute or so, just to let you sort of reach for your glass of red wine and type any questions or anything at this stage. Adam, really great question. And actually what I'm about to come on to next in a way, actually, because I think it's my view really that issues and debates can underpin almost everything you're doing in both year 1 and 2. And the more effectively your students know those issues and debates, you're right, the more sophisticated their evaluation becomes, the more effective it becomes, and they can write far fewer points but with higher quality that will gain them the marks as well. And that's a strategy I would certainly be going with. Brilliant. Hope that's answered your question. So I'm going to move on. Any more questions, keep typing as we go through. Okay, on to the second section, which is how to make the most out of your year 2 topics. 4 much shorter sections in this one, so don't worry, I'm not going to keep talking at you all night. The first one is looking at selecting the best or the shortest topics. Now, you may have noticed this, you might not have noticed this, and this is particularly interesting, that AQA have been particularly biased that some of the topics are significantly longer than others, and if you look through them, you will spot that a mile off. And don't be fooled by the specification either. Okay, so if you look at sort of the grid on the board, on the screen, you'll see that actually in cognition and development, which is in the group with relationships and gender, there are only really 7 sort of subtopics in comparison to 10 in gender and 10 in relationships. So therefore, if you were picking purely mathematically, you would pick cognition and development over the other 2. I'm curious. I'm going to ask Jim to launch the next question. I want to know who's actually selected cognition, or who selected relationships and gender as their topic. So I'm just curious who's actually gone with cognition. Interesting, exactly what I thought it would be. Yeah, gender and relationships do seem far more popular, I think, because people have typically taught them before. It might be worth having a look over cognition development because it is just significantly shorter, and there's quite a nice overlap with attachment in places as well, so you get to sort of revise attachment. Again, we'll quickly do the same. As you'll notice, schizophrenia and eating behaviours are both 10 topics each compared to stress, which is 13. Again, I'm just curious, who's chosen schizophrenia or eating, and who's chosen stress? Okay, exactly as I thought. Okay, that's great. I thought I had assumed that most people would have gone for schizophrenia or eating in that case. And then last but not least, aggression, 10 topics. Addiction has always been historically fairly unpopular, but forensic, which I think is going to be popular, and I'll be asking you that in a moment, is much longer. So forensic is 13 subtopics versus 10 and 11 in the other two. Final sort of poll on this one. Who's picked forensic versus the other two topics there? Okay, a bit more mixed in this particular case. Really interesting. But yeah, worth having a look over and worth just considering actually the length of the topics you're choosing, because actually if you chose stress, forensic and say relationships, you've given yourself considerably more work than if you chose the sort of shorter topics. Fortunately, someone's just pointed out that I would say there's no such thing as a best topic, and really it depends on the nature of your students and your own preferences as a teacher. What I believe is the real key is whichever topics you do pick, it's drawing the links between the topics you've selected and the year one content, as well as the appropriate issues and debates. Okay, so I do really think that actually it's not about the topics you pick, it's about how well you use them, so to speak. Okay, I want to give you some examples on that. So actually there's plenty of ways that if you look at it strategically, you can use year one content, year two topics to revise year one content. Okay, for example, if you want to revise abnormality, there's certain places within schizophrenia and eating behaviours where you can directly go back to some of the concepts you've learned in abnormality, and I'll give you an example of exactly that in a moment. Likewise, if you want to revise CBT, that appears in both schizophrenia and addiction. So you could make the case when you're teaching schizophrenia or addiction to revise CBT from year one as well. Likewise, revisiting or revising Freud, gender, forensic and ideographic approach all lend themselves to actually spending a session revising Freud as well. So just knowing where that overlap occurs, I think, is really important. Likewise, behaviourist or learning theories appears in both eating behaviour and addiction, so you can use those topics to revise learning theories. And then last but not least, social learning theory appears in gender, eating and aggression, which actually some of you may be doing those three topics together. So great opportunity to revise social learning theory if you're doing those, okay? What I'd like to do now is give you an idea of exactly what I mean about how to use a year two topic to revise year one learning, because I think actually it's more important than people will make out. So I want to give you an activity here that if you're doing schizophrenia will be really, really useful, but if not, just to give you some sort of food for thought. The aim of this activity is called schizophrenia, depression or bipolar, and the aim of this activity is designed to consider the validity of classifying and diagnosing schizophrenia by looking at what's known as symptom overlap, by looking at the different symptoms that occur for schizophrenia and other disorders, and I've chosen depression and bipolar. Now, the way this particular activity works is you can give your students a sort of word bank of all of the different symptoms that you choose. So I've given you a whole list of ones there, so it could be things like affective flattening, changes in appetite, delusions, depressed mood, etc. And their job is then to use the Venn diagram, and you'll get access to this resource at the end, to plot which ones of those symptoms appear in schizophrenia, depression and bipolar on their own, which ones overlap between two of the disorders, and which ones overlap between all three of the disorders, okay? I've not necessarily done this correctly, but just to give you an idea, they might put delusions between schizophrenia and bipolar, and then maybe changes in appetite for all three of them, okay? And they would do that for all the symptoms. Now, the key is here, what you want to make a real point of doing, because I think you've got the time, and I'll talk about that later, is to actually, if you've covered depression, which you will have done in year one, is to make a real point at this time to actually stop the kind of learning and the lesson, and actually go back to your year one content. So let's imagine that your students have listed all of the symptoms that appear in depression in the Venn diagram. Okay, what you can then ask them to do is say, right, take all of those symptoms that you've listed in depression, and I want you to highlight which ones are cognitive, which ones are behavioural, and which ones are emotional characteristics, okay? And then get them to really be looking at the criteria they need back for their year one content, okay? And I think that's really important. I can see what is likely to happen with time pressures and teaching, that you think it's a great revision opportunity but don't actually make a point of it. And I think you've got the time in year two to actually take a bit longer over the topics and actually use it as a really valuable revision opportunity, okay? So just one little idea that how you can effectively do that in quite a simple way. The other thing to look for is the overlap between the Year 2 topics that you select. Okay, for example, evolutionary explanations appears in relationship to eating and aggression. So therefore, making sure that your students really understand what evolutionary explanations are in evolution and natural selection is really important. I know that my students last year struggled with understanding evolutionary explanations towards eating behaviour, and therefore, if I knew it was covered in all three of my topics, I would have made a much bigger point about doing a lesson that collectively brought those together. Likewise, if you're teaching gender, eating and aggression, social learning theory appears in all three of those topics, and therefore it's really, really important that your students understand social learning theory effectively to apply it to those different theories. Okay. A sort of slightly different one, but the diathesis stress model will be really, really useful in schizophrenia, but also then in the nature-nurture debate, in issues and debates. So again, a really, really important overlap that you could make a point of going to. And last but not least, the role of dopamine appears nearly everywhere. So it appears in eating behaviours, in anorexia, aggression, forensic and addiction. So again, you've got the time to sort of actually use those core concepts which are highlighted at the top of the screen to make a point of sort of looking at that overlap and getting the students to explore the theories or the concepts through the different topics. And I think that's really important. In terms of mapping issues and debates, I just want to show you a few examiners' comments, because historically, before we look at how to do it, it's important to realise that it's been a bit of an issue in psychology for many, many years, that students don't know what different terms mean, like nature and nurture. A couple of sort of really, really important comments just to pick out that examiners will be hitting their head on the table with. Gender bias is often used incorrectly. Many students think that if a study uses testosterone or an aggression, it's therefore biased in some way. And really it's not. It's just a matter of fact that males actually have more testosterone than females. So that doesn't mean there's a gender bias. Probably a more common one, cultural bias is very, very commonly misused in gender. Okay, and just because the study's done in one place, it doesn't mean it's culturally biased. It just means it's limited in some way. Okay, and it's worth even showing your students these comments. In terms of more recent comments, determinism is one that students always get wrong, and this is an examiner's report which I don't necessarily agree with, so to speak, because they've said all explanations and theories are deterministic in some way, but what students should avoid doing is referring to determinism generally. So if you look back to the example I gave earlier, I really deliberately chose environmental determinism and made it much more specific because I thought that was important. And lastly, students say that everything is reductionist, and it's not, and this is a really, really common one which I've seen a lot as well, that the only theory is really, reductionism really is a biological term. Students can use the term limited, which is much more important. So actually if they're saying that a cognitive explanation is limited in some way, therefore it ignores other factors, that's a better word to use. Better to use narrow or limited than reductionism incorrectly. So yeah, those terms are used incorrectly a lot. What I want to look at now is a couple of activities that will help you getting your students to embed issues and debates effectively into your optional units this year. And the first one ensures that they must know the terms explicitly. A new activity, which we've only literally just finished putting together, which is a really, really nice one. It's called Issues and Debates Quiz Quiz Trade. If you've ever played Quiz Quiz Trade before, really, really useful. And it's great if you want students to learn key definitions. That's the whole point of this particular activity, okay? Emily's clearly used it. The way the activity works is really, really simple. So there are 9 cards in this set, so there's one for each of the issues and debates. You need duplicates, so if you've got a big class, even better. And you give your students each one card, and very simply they then pair up with someone and they take turns in asking their question. Now the important bit is, so if I went up to someone, I'm going to use Emily as the example now, and I said what is meant by nature, whatever answer she gives, it's important that I then give her the answer that's written on the card. So I read it out word for word every single time. Emily would then swap roles with me and she'd ask me her question, what's meant by the term nature, and once we finished, very simply, we swap cards, trade bit, and then we wander around and find a new pair. What you'll find is that if you watch your students do this and sort of sit back for 10-15 minutes, all of a sudden they'll really start to grasp these key terms explicitly, and that's really important. So they just learn these definitions by rote, which maybe not the best way of learning, but it certainly helps to make sure they've got this concrete picture of issues and debates before you do anything else. Absolutely, yeah, the cards will be available tonight, so yeah, you can feel free to use them straight away. Now, the reason I mention that is because then if you want to map issues and debates into your year 1 and 2 content, you want them to know what the words are before they start using the words incorrectly. So these final couple of slides just show you different ways that where biological determinism fits into the spec. So it appears in gender, schizophrenia, eating, aggression, forensic and addiction. And making sure your students know exactly when and where to use it is really important. Likewise, environmental determinism appears in attachment, psychopathology, eating, forensic. Psychic determinism appears in gender, so Freudian theories, forensic and addiction as well. So really, really useful just to know exactly where it appears. Likewise, nature-nurture debate, really, really famous debate that students seem to like and enjoy. Knowing what actually the diathesis stress model is and genetic vulnerability, and where sort of different parts of the debate really appear throughout the course. So to give you one example, the fact that nurture affects nature appears in the new biopsych content and the Maguire taxi driver study. So knowing how to map them out and using that little activity will just get them really, really used to these key terms. Brilliant. Okay, nearly there. I'm just going to pause for another 30 seconds or so. Any questions at this stage, feel free to ask, and then we'll just look at a year plan and then open up for some more debate at the end. I can see a yes, but I can't see a question, so I'll carry on and then we'll open it up for discussion at the end. Oh, right, would you start year 2 of issues and debates, Lisa? I'm literally just about to go on to that, so I'll hold off answering that for a moment. Yes, the grenade poster is going to be available in the resources that I'll tell you where they are in a moment. Thanks for the wine break. Okay. Final session. This is much shorter before we open it up for sort of any final questions. Order of teaching, what to teach and when to teach. Now, this is really going from my own personal experience and what I think works, but it will really depend on your school, the number of teachers you've got and so forth. But what I will sort of indicate here at the end is how much time you'll have available probably at the end, which goes back to an earlier point I made in terms of you've got the sort of freedom to take your time as you go through the course this year. So on the screen, and you'll have this available as a Word document at the end. In the college that I used to work in, we had what was called a major-minor split. So we had 3 hour-and-a-half lessons with the students each week. The major teacher would get 2 of those lessons and the minor teacher would get 1 of those lessons. And even when I was the only teacher for a group, I would still teach it in this particular split. I liked having a lesson a week dedicated to something that wasn't the content that I was always learning. So as you'll see, what I would probably do is start the year with what I think is the harder of the optional topics I would have chosen. So I would have gone with schizophrenia, and that could all be covered pretty much by the October half term, including an end of unit test. Alongside that, though, I would be teaching issues and debates from day one. So to answer, I think it was Lisa's question earlier, absolutely, I'll be teaching issues and debates straight away. I think it's important they know these concepts. And if you're going fully linear, there's an argument to say teach it from the beginning of year 1. I would then, in term 2 or half term 2, move on to forensic. But again, I would keep a lesson a week, or a double lesson in my case a week, for research methods to start tackling the sort of year 2 research method content. And you'll see that yet again forensic will finish itself nearly by, or it will finish itself by Christmas, again with an end of unit test. Research methods carries on into the sort of 3rd term, the January term, at which point I always like to finish with the easiest topic and the one they like, so I would have gone with relationships to finish with, and then I would just round off at the end with the remaining biopsych. Now, assuming that goes to plan, which things never do in teaching, and we know that, what that means is on paper, you'd be finished by the week commencing the 20th of February, which would then leave you with, I think it was 10 weeks revision, because the exam this year is on the 7th of June for the first one, then the 14th, and then the 22nd. So what you can see is that leaves you with an awful lot of revision time, and I wouldn't want 10 weeks left at the end of the course for revision, because I think the students would lose the will to live. So it just reinforces the point I made earlier, that you've got much more time to sort of take your time with these things, make sure you're revising the year 1 contents as you go along, and enjoy the course as you do it, because you are going to have a lot more time. You have taught nearly 2/3 of the course already by the start of year 2, because paper 1 and paper 2 at AS, if you did the first AS exam, meant that you taught a lot and crammed it in. So take your time with it and make sure you don't end up with a situation where you've got 10 weeks revision. But this is all available to you anyway, which leads me on to my final point. What we will do immediately after this webinar is finished in sort of 15 minutes time is post the resources in our AQA A Level Psychology teachers groups. If you want them instantly, they'll be on there. If you aren't in the group and not on Facebook, don't worry, tomorrow morning I've already set the post up at 7 o'clock. It will appear on our blog, so you can download all of the resources on our blog, and you'll then get the email for 8 o'clock as you would any morning, giving you a link where you can download them. So that's that part. Don't forget all of the future webinars that we've got sort of lined up. There are, as I say, 24 more for AQA, and there is also the scope to do more if people want particular topics. So we have a load on research methods and one for every one of the optional topics coming up. Please, if you haven't already, follow us on Twitter and spread the good word we're doing, because we put these on for free and we want as many people to join them as we can. And we've got 102 in the session now, which is amazing, but the more we can get in, the better, so we can have up to 200. And encourage students to join a new group we set up for A-level students. If you want to know they're getting decent advice through social media, encourage them to join our group. And if ever you need any questions, support, advice, guidance, and I spotted a few of you are new to teaching this year, do just drop me an email, because I'm available most of the time to sort of answer any urgent queries or provide lessons, etc. I'm going to pause here and leave it back open to any questions from all of you. So we've got about 10-15 minutes for any last questions to round off the evening. So many people have said thank you. I've lost track of the questions now as the chat window's gone. I'll try and scroll back up and answer any that I've missed. If I miss any questions, click on my name and send it to me directly, because then it comes up in a different colour. It's just much easier for me to see. Sylvia, what advice give to students on what makes an excellent essay? Great question. I'm not sure if you're in our Facebook group or you've seen, we've actually got a whole pack of resources. I think it's 12 resources dedicated to essay writing. And we're giving them away free because it was designed for the ATP conference this year, and we had some leftovers. So if you email customer service at tutorstew.net, we'll be able to send you out a pack of resources that will really show you what an excellent essay looks like. Victoria, how will students know the breakdown of questions like an 8-marker you showed? The key is they won't, and they're not meant to. This is an interesting question, actually. Because it's now marked holistically, in theory, it's not always, as this is going to sound weird, but it's not always as clear cut as 3 and 5 or 4 and 4. And students and examiners shouldn't be approaching the question that way. They should be answering the question as a whole now. So they won't know the breakdown, and they shouldn't really worry or need to know the breakdown, because the key is they have to answer all the components to get the marks now. They can't just answer the knowledge part and get the knowledge marks, or the evaluation and get the evaluation. They actually have to do a good job of all of it to score good marks. Lisa, I was going to start with forensic and relationships. Would you advise not doing forensic until after I've covered issues and debates? A bit like what I showed in my year plan. I guess the key is that I wouldn't do issues and debates for all my lessons at the start of the year, because I don't think the students would be as interested in it. I would sort of have the 1 lesson a week or the double lesson a week for issues and debates, and then that way it doesn't actually matter what topic you start with. I think it's always nice that, well, I've personally always gone with the most difficult year 2 topic first to kind of get them in, realising that actually it's more serious and it's more difficult at that stage, and then progressively get easier so that by the end of the year they find the topics a doddle, but that's just personal preference. Xanthi, also, would you always teach research methods as a discrete lesson? Oh, great question. Yes, I would. I would teach research methods as a topic standalone. But I guess the beauty is I would embed it as I go through. So looking at those sample questions, making sure you sort of find opportunities when you're teaching, say, whichever your topics you're teaching, relationships, gender, to then sort of focus on the bits that are relevant to those. So you saw there that one was a questionnaire to males and females. So at that point, use that as an opportunity to revise questionnaires and make sure, again, you're constantly referring back to the year 1 content, which they still need to know. Just seeing if I've missed any more questions. Oh, right, yeah, Polly, how would you suggest the structure of counter-arguing, which you mentioned? That's actually, funny enough, in the essay writing resources. So again, Polly, if you email for a set of those, it's exactly the same format, funny enough. They make their point. They provide, usually, if you're going to go with a counter-argument, they would provide evidence, so they'd have a study. And then at that point, they would then bring in a counter argument to that study. So they might say a limitation of that study and what impacts that has. And there's some examples of that in the resource pack. So if you ask for a copy of the ATP resource pack as well, you'll see some examples of how I've done it. It's a very similar structure to what I covered. Priscilla, not yet for sociology. It's on our agenda, so hopefully soon, but not yet. How many grenade points would you be looking for in a good evaluation? Oh, good question. Again, the key is quality over quantity. So actually, although I embedded one in the example that I gave, there's nothing to stop you embedding 2 or 3 and really expanding sort of the burger even further. So there is no end limit to it as long as they're effective and coherently and really well presented. I've seen essays that have got nearly 4 marks with really only one evaluation point that's just extended time and time again or elaborated on time and time again. So if they can do it well and keep running with a point, then they can pick up the marks that way. Just scrolling down. Would you go back through the topics, how you've laid them out, then use the 10 weeks to revisit everything? No, Debbie, when I threw that together, it was just to see, really to plan out and see when you would finish teaching. Typically from sort of experience, when you teach it, every topic seems to overrun by about 1 or 2 weeks. And as I kind of mentioned in this webinar, I'd much rather take my time, and if a lesson seemed to warrant itself to revise in depression, like the schizophrenia example I gave you, then I would totally devote the lesson to that, because I know that I've got the time at the end. I wouldn't want 10 weeks left at the end for revision, because I think the students would lose interest and lose focus at that point. So I would probably extend out each of my optional topics by a week or 2 weeks, extend out research methods by another week or so, and issues and debates, and then probably leave myself sort of 4 or 5 weeks to then go back over the year 1 stuff in particular. Do you think the students will be at a disadvantage if we teach in the following order? Research methods, approaches, biopsych, gender, schizophrenia, addiction, then into revision? No, Xanthi, not necessarily. I'd need to see it as a whole plan, but I don't think so. I think the key is, as I mentioned today, is drawing the links between the different units and so forth, so not necessarily. But if you want to send me a full plan to have a look at, feel free to do so. Oh, I've somehow lost my chat window. Have I missed any questions? I think I've covered all the questions, so I'll be here for a few more moments. If I've missed any, please retype. So I was scrolling through all the thank yous. Joe, great question. In terms of the reason I would advise extending evaluation and embedding the issues and debates and so forth is because if you look at word count, the word count to an essay, they will actually be able to write more succinctly. So you can actually get sort of top mark band for evaluation with fewer points if you embed. There is nothing to stop the students actually, and I did do this for my weaker students last year who couldn't grasp evaluation particularly well. The key to them was to write effective, simple burgers, so to speak, and you can write more of those. So there is a quality quantity trade-off, that if they just don't understand how to embed the issues and debates and they're not going to get it, then they can write more effective, smaller points and still get the marks. The problem is it will take them more writing to do that, and therefore they'll be at a time disadvantage that way. So therefore it's easier to go with the approach I've done for time, but if they can't get it effectively, then actually they're better off writing shorter, succinct points, but more of them. Very welcome. Candice, I'm just reading your question now. Oh, you only have 4 hours of lessons a week. Okay. Yeah, I had a PGC student last year as well. I would give them I wouldn't just, if you've only got 4 hours of lessons a week and you were giving her one of those, I wouldn't devote it to, well, unless it fits within a plan, I wouldn't devote it just to revision from the start of the year. I'd ask her to teach some of the content and give her a topic probably one of the easier topics conceptually in the ones that you're choosing. So I probably would avoid something like schizophrenia or eating behaviours, and probably go with something like relationships, and sort of really support and guide her through teaching the topic, I think, because it sounds like you might not have the time if you went with giving her a revision lesson. Any tips on weaker students writing sophisticated evaluations? We have scaffolding resources. Yes, there are, and there's some in that ATP resource pack, funnily enough, that I've mentioned. So if you email for a copy of that pack, the key is that if we're honest, and I had this, I mean, I had students with MEGs of very low E grades, and my aim was never to get them writing sort of the style of evaluation I've showed you today, because actually it may have been unachievable. And the minute their point becomes ineffective, they've wasted time. So if they bring in an issue and debate and they do it incorrectly, then it was pointless them starting it to begin with. So if they're not going to be able to sort of conceptually write a point in the style I've done today, then they're better off actually going with more straightforward points, but write more of them and pick up the marks that way. But yeah, there are some scaffolding resources available. Okay, any final questions? Because we're at 9:15 now, so I'll hang around for a few more minutes. Victoria, I'll literally post them on the Facebook group once I get out of this chat window. Joe, yes. The point with determinism is if your students are going to use it, I would advise that they pick a sort of correct one, so like environmental determinism, psychic determinism. I think you're referring to reductionism in terms of the biological point. So with reductionism, students would typically say that everything is reductionist if it was a cognitive theory, but reductionism really relates to sort of very specific biological theories, that if we break a behaviour down to sort of just genes, that would be reductionist in nature. Whereas if we just look at a cognitive theory, it's just limited in nature. Adam, I think you have to some extent because it appears separately. So yeah, I would say yes. Okay, final 2 minutes. Xanthi, I would avoid it, and I would say that a behavioural explanation like conditioning is limited because it doesn't take into account other factors. And there's nothing wrong with them saying limited. It's really it's a better word for them to be using. Right, guys, I'm going to call that an evening then, so I'm going to close the window now. Any questions, you've got my email address on there, so feel free to drop me an email now or ask a question in the Facebook group and I'll post the resources straight away. So thank you. See those of you tomorrow that are attending the schizophrenia one or even the biopsych one on Thursday.